A 74-year-old mechanic working in a small garage got a phone call that would save NASA's $4.2 billion space program. What he did next shocked the entire aerospace industry and reminded the world that some knowledge never gets old. Welcome to True Hero Stories. Before we begin this incredible tale of forgotten expertise and aerospace heroism, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the unsung heroes whose knowledge still shapes our world. The morning sun cast long shadows across Richardson's Auto Repair, a modest two-bay garage nestled between a diner and a hardware store in Huntsville, Alabama. The faded sign above the entrance had weathered 40 years of southern heat and winter storms, its red paint now more rust than color. Inside, the familiar sounds of automotive work echoed off concrete walls stained with decades of honest labor. The hiss of air tools, the clang of metal on metal, and the steady rhythm of progress measured in fixed transmissions and rebuilt engines. Tom Richardson knelt beside a 1995 Ford pickup truck, his weathered hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent more than half his life diagnosing mechanical problems. At 74, his back protested each morning when he rose from bed, and his knees reminded him of every year that had passed since his retirement from NASA in 1998. But his mind remained sharp, his hands steady, and his passion for solving mechanical puzzles as strong as it had been during the golden age of the Apollo program. Most people in Huntsville knew Tom as the guy who could fix anything with wheels and an engine. They brought him their sick cars, their temperamental lawnmowers, their broken tractors. He charged fair prices, finished jobs when he promised, and never talked much about his past. When pressed by curious customers about the framed photographs on his office wall, images of massive rocket engines and clean room assembly operations, Tom would simply say he used to work at the Space Center and change the subject. What they didn't know was that Thomas Richardson had been one of NASA's most brilliant propulsion engineers. For 32 years, he had designed, tested, and troubleshot some of the most complex machinery ever built by human hands. His fingerprints were literally on the engines that had carried 12 men to the moon. His calculations had helped bring Apollo 13 home safely. His innovations had made the space shuttle program possible. But in 1998, when budget cuts and restructuring swept through NASA like a cold wind, Tom's position had been eliminated. At 54, he was told he was too old to adapt to new technologies and too expensive to retain. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same hands that had once calibrated rocket engines capable of generating 7.6 million pounds of thrust now changed oil filters and replaced brake pads. But Tom harbored no bitterness. Work was work, and problems were problems. Whether it was getting a Saturn V to the moon or getting a Honda Civic to start on a cold morning, the fundamentals remained the same. Understand the system, identify the failure, find the solution. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Tom had arrived at the shop before dawn, as was his habit, unlocking the bay doors and firing up the ancient coffee pot that had been brewing his morning fuel since the Clinton administration. The Ford pickup belonged to Mrs. Patterson, a widow whose late husband had bought the truck new and maintained it religiously until his passing 3 years earlier. Now the transmission was slipping, and she couldn't afford to replace it. Tom had quoted her a rebuild at cost, knowing she was living on Social Security and couldn't afford much more. He was elbow deep in the transmission when his cell phone rang. The number on the display was unfamiliar, but something about the area code made him pause. It was a Houston exchange, NASA territory. Tom wiped his hands on a shop rag and answered with his usual gruff hello. "Mr. Richardson, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from NASA Johnson Space Center. I'm the current director of propulsion systems for the Artemis program." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't heard from anyone at NASA in over 20 years. "What can I do for you, Doctor?" "Chen?" "Sir, we have a situation. A critical failure in our SLS rocket engine system. We've exhausted all conventional solutions, and frankly, We're running out of time. Your name came up in our archives as someone who might have historical knowledge of similar issues. Tom set down his wrench and walked to his small office, closing the door behind him. Through the window, he could see the Space Center in the distance, its massive vehicle assembly building rising like a cathedral dedicated to human ambition. What kind of failure are we talking about? Catastrophic combustion instability in the RS-25 engine cluster. We're seeing pressure oscillations that are tearing the engines apart during testing. 3 test firings, 3 complete failures. We've got the best minds in aerospace engineering on this, but we're missing something fundamental. Tom was quiet for a long moment. He knew the RS-25 engines intimately. They were evolved versions of the Space Shuttle main engines he had helped develop in the 1970s. Combustion instability was a ghost that had haunted rocket engineers since the dawn of liquid fuel propulsion. What's your timeline? The Artemis 1 launch is scheduled for 6 weeks from today. Congress is breathing down our necks, the international partners are getting nervous, and we've got $4.2 billion invested in this mission. If we can't solve this problem, the entire program could be scrapped. Tom looked at the photograph on his desk, a black and white image of himself as a young engineer standing next to the business end of a Saturn V first stage. He had been 28 years old, fresh out of Georgia Tech, convinced he could help humanity reach the stars. More than 50 years later, it seemed humanity was still trying to get back to where it had already been. Dr. Chen, I haven't worked on rocket engines in over 2 decades. Your current team has access to computer modeling and diagnostic tools I could only dream of when I was active. Mr. Richardson, with all due respect, computer models can only tell us what we program them to look for. Sometimes you need someone who's felt the engines run, who's heard them sing when they're working right and scream when they're not. We need institutional knowledge that exists in only a few places anymore. Tom was quiet again, his mind already working on the problem despite his reservations. Combustion instability was like a mechanical disease. It could have dozens of causes, from injector design to propellant mixing ratios to acoustic resonance in the combustion chamber. The fact that NASA's current team couldn't solve it suggested they were either missing something obvious or facing something genuinely new. I'll need to see the test data, Tom said finally. Engine specs, failure analysis, high-speed photography of the combustion events, everything you've got. We can have a car there in 30 minutes. Tom looked around his small office at the invoices and work orders that represented his current reality, then back at the photograph of his younger self. Make it 20. And Dr. Chen, you might want to clear your afternoon. This could take a while. An hour later, Tom Richardson sat in the same conference room where he had once briefed astronauts on engine performance. The room had been renovated twice since his retirement, but the long table and wall-mounted displays remained. Around him sat a dozen of NASA's brightest engineers, men and women young enough to be his grandchildren, their faces reflecting a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. Dr. Chen, a sharp-featured woman in her early 40s, stood at the head of the table next to a massive display screen, showing a complex schematic of the SLS rocket's engine configuration. Mr. Richardson, let me bring you up to speed on what we're dealing with. For the next 20 minutes, Tom absorbed information at a rate that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. The current team had indeed done excellent work. Their diagnostics were thorough, their modeling sophisticated, their analysis methodical. But as he studied the data, a familiar pattern began to emerge. The pressure oscillations weren't random. They followed a specific frequency signature that tickled something deep in his memory. "Show me the injector plate design," Tom said quietly. Dr. Chen pulled up a detailed schematic of the engine's injector system, the critical component that mixed liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen in precisely the right proportions for combustion. The design was elegant, computer-optimized for maximum efficiency and performance. Tom studied the screen for a long moment, then asked a question that made several engineers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Who approved this injector pattern? It was developed using our latest computational fluid dynamics models, answered Dr. Marcus Webb, the lead engine designer. We optimized for thrust efficiency and manufacturability. What about acoustic damping? We incorporated standard damping techniques based on current best practices. Tom was quiet for another moment, his mind racing back 45 years to a similar conference room, a similar crisis, and a solution that had saved the Apollo program from a similar fate. Dr. Chen, may I see the original space shuttle main engine injector design? The request seemed to puzzle several people in the room, but Dr. Chen nodded to one of her assistants, who pulled up the older schematic on an adjacent screen. The two designs appeared side by side, the current SLS injector and its ancestor from the 1970s. To most of the people in the room, the differences were subtle, but to Tom Richardson, they told a story as clear as a highway map. The modern design had been optimized by computers that understood fluid dynamics, but had never felt the physical reality of a rocket engine trying to tear itself apart. "There's your problem," Tom said, standing and walking to the display. He pointed to a specific area of the injector pattern. "You've created an acoustic resonance chamber. The combustion frequency is hitting the natural resonance of the injector plate, and that's causing the pressure oscillations." Dr. Webb leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Mr. Richardson, our acoustic modeling shows no resonance issues in that frequency range." "Your modeling is wrong," Tom said simply. "Not because your computers aren't sophisticated enough, but because they're not modeling the right variables. The resonance isn't just in the metal, it's in the combustion process itself. The flame front is creating a feedback loop with the acoustic properties of the chamber." The room fell silent. Several engineers exchanged glances, clearly uncertain whether they were witnessing breakthrough insight or the confused ramblings of an old man clinging to outdated knowledge. Dr. Chen broke the silence. "How do you know this?" Tom walked to another display and began sketching with a digital stylus, his movements quick and confident despite his age. "Because we faced the exact same problem in 1973 during early space shuttle engine development. Took us 8 months and 6 destroyed engines to figure it out. The solution isn't in the computer models, it's in the metal." He finished his sketch, a modified injector pattern that looked almost identical to the current design, but with subtle changes in the spacing and orientation of the injection elements. "You need to introduce controlled turbulence in the mixing zone. It disrupts the acoustic coupling without significantly impacting performance." Dr. Webb studied the sketch, his skepticism gradually giving way to interest. "This would require completely redesigning the injector manufacturing process." "No," Tom said. "It would require going back to the manufacturing process we used 40 years ago, the one that worked." For the next 2 hours, Tom walked the engineering team through the physics of acoustic combustion instability with a clarity and depth that left even the most senior engineers taking notes. He explained concepts that weren't in textbooks, shared insights that came only from years of hands-on experience with systems that had no room for failure. But more importantly, he helped them understand something their computers couldn't teach them, that sometimes the most sophisticated solution wasn't the right solution. Sometimes engineering was about accepting the messy realities of physics rather than trying to optimize them away. Dr. Chen made the decision to implement Tom's modifications that same afternoon. Within 48 hours, a new injector plate had been manufactured using the modified design. The test firing was scheduled for the following Monday. Tom returned to his garage that Friday with mixed feelings. He had spent 3 days immersed in the world he had loved and lost, surrounded by brilliant minds working on humanity's greatest adventure. But he also knew that his part in the story was likely over. He had shared what he knew, offered what help he could. The young engineers would take it from here. He was under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's truck when his phone rang Monday afternoon. The caller ID showed Dr. Chen's number. "Mr. Richardson, I thought you'd want to know. The engine test was flawless. No pressure oscillations, no combustion instability. Perfect burn for the full duration." Tom smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered features. "That's good news, Dr. Chen. Really good news." "Sir, there's something else. The entire engineering team wants to invite you to the Artemis 1 launch. Front row seats in the VIP section. What do you say? Tom looked around his small garage, at Mrs. Patterson's truck and the other vehicles waiting for his attention. Then he looked out the window toward the Space Center, where a massive rocket was being prepared to carry humanity back toward the moon. "I'd be honored," he said. 6 weeks later, Tom Richardson sat in the VIP section at Kennedy Space Center, wearing his cleanest work shirt and the NASA pin Dr. Chen had given him. Around him sat astronauts, engineers, politicians, and celebrities. But Tom felt most connected to the rocket itself, standing on the pad like a 322-foot-tall monument to human determination. When the countdown reached 0 and the engines ignited, Tom felt the familiar rumble in his chest, the same sensation he had experienced hundreds of times during engine tests 4 decades earlier. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just watching a rocket launch. He was watching the culmination of a problem solved, a crisis averted, a program saved. As Artemis 1 lifted off into the Florida sky, carrying humanity's hopes for returning to the moon, Tom thought about the young engineers in the conference room who had listened to an old mechanic's advice. They represented the future of space exploration, and he had been privileged to pass along a small piece of the past that might help them succeed. The rocket disappeared into the blue sky, carrying with it not just sophisticated instruments and scientific experiments, but also the accumulated knowledge of generations of engineers who had dared to dream of reaching the stars. In a very real sense, Tom Richardson was aboard that spacecraft, his expertise and experience woven into every component that functioned flawlessly as the vehicle climbed toward orbit. After the launch, as the crowds dispersed and the VIP section emptied, Tom remained in his seat for a few extra minutes. Dr. Chen approached him, her face radiant with the success of the mission. "Mr. Richardson, I can't thank you enough for what you did. Without your insight, we might have lost the entire program." Tom stood slowly, his joints protesting after sitting for several hours. "Dr. Chen, you and your team did the hard work. I just helped you remember something we learned a long time ago. What's next for you? Are you interested in a consulting position with NASA? We could use someone with your institutional knowledge on a permanent basis." Tom considered the offer for a moment, then shook his head with a small smile. "I appreciate that, but I've got Mrs. Patterson's transmission to finish, and Mr. Davis is bringing his tractor in next week. Besides, you don't need me anymore. You know what to look for now." As he walked toward the parking lot, Tom's phone buzzed with a text message from his young assistant at the garage. "Boss, Mrs. Patterson called. She says her truck is running like new. What did you do to it?" Tom typed back a simple reply. "Fixed what was broken." That evening, back in his small apartment above the garage, Tom sat in his favorite chair and looked again at the photograph on his desk, the young engineer standing next to the Saturn V engine. In the background of that old picture, barely visible in the shadows, stood a group of other engineers, technicians, and workers whose names had been forgotten by history, but whose contributions had made the impossible possible. Tom understood now that he had never really left NASA, and NASA had never really left him. Knowledge didn't retire, experience didn't become obsolete, and sometimes the most important thing an old engineer could do was remind young engineers that the fundamentals never changed, only the tools used to apply them. The next morning, Tom Richardson returned to his garage, fired up the ancient coffee pot, and got back to work. But now he worked with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that somewhere in space, a spacecraft was carrying humanity toward the moon, using engines that bore the invisible signature of a 74-year-old mechanic who had never forgotten how to make rockets sing. 3 months later, when Artemis 1 successfully completed its mission and splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean, Tom was again under the hood of a customer's car. But this time, when the phone rang with congratulations from Dr. Chen and her team, he answered with grease-stained hands and a smile in his voice. The space program would continue. New challenges would arise, and young engineers would solve problems that hadn't yet been imagined. But they would do so standing on the shoulders of giants, engineers like Tom Richardson, who had learned through trial and error, success and failure, that the most important tool in any engineer's toolkit was the wisdom to know when something was wrong and the courage to speak up when everyone else thought it was right. In the end, that phone call to a small garage in Alabama had saved more than a space program. It had bridged the gap between past and future, between institutional knowledge and innovative thinking, between the generation that had first reached for the moon and the generation that would go back to stay. And in his garage, surrounded by the honest work of fixing broken things, Tom Richardson continued to prove that some knowledge never gets old. It just waits patiently for the moment when it's needed most. Tom Richardson's story reminds us that true expertise isn't about the latest technology or the newest techniques. It's about understanding fundamental principles that don't change, even when everything around them does. His 30 years at NASA didn't disappear when he retired. They simply waited in a small garage until the moment they were needed to save a $4.2 billion space program. Have you ever met someone like Tom? A person whose incredible knowledge was hidden behind a humble job? Maybe a teacher who revolutionized education, a mechanic who solved impossible problems, or a grandparent whose old-fashioned wisdom turned out to be exactly what was needed. Share their story in the comments below. Tell us about the unsung heroes in your life, the people whose experience and knowledge made a difference when it mattered most. Your story could inspire our next video. If Tom's story moved you, hit that like button. It helps us reach more people who need to hear these incredible tales of hidden expertise and quiet heroism. And don't forget to subscribe to True Hero Stories. We publish these powerful narratives every week because we believe that real knowledge and experience deserve recognition, no matter how humble their current circumstances. From which city are you watching today? Drop your location in the comments. We love seeing our global community of people who understand that heroes come in all forms and wisdom can be found in the most unexpected places. Remember, the person fixing your car, teaching your children, or cleaning your office might just be the person who changes the world when no one expects it. Keep your eyes open for the hidden experts around you. You never know when their knowledge might save the day. Thank you for being part of the True Hero Stories family. We'll see you in the next one. And until then, never underestimate the power of experience, the value of institutional knowledge, and the quiet heroism of those who solve problems without seeking recognition. Where are you watching from? Share your city and tell us about a hidden expert you know.